everyone to today's quite crowded but very casual follow-up to Woody Holton's lecture last night. I would say that we knew we wanted to have some kind of follow-up event after Woody's talk about his book Liberty is Sweet last night, and then decided we'd get together and have a chat about some of these themes and about the founders today. Driven, well, there's one person here who's like a real expert on thinking about the founders. That's our faculty fellow, our distinguished faculty fellow, Alan Gibson, over here on the left, on far left, right, stage left. And then the rest of us, it's based on, well, I'm me and who happen to be around really, and not on vacation, not at a conference, and not everything else. So that's scary. That never happened before. I guess we have the two-way connectivity. It's going.
We all laugh.
That did sound like a familiar laugh.
It's not this.
We were telling you on the tour about the ghosts.
No, I found it.
What is it?
iPhone guest.
iPhone guest.
I'm gonna mute everybody. Oh wait, no.
No, do the.
Mute us.
Yes, do that.
I'm gonna unmute us as soon as I make sure everybody else is muted. Sorry, Jeff.
That's all right. Anyway, well,
She's
this
listening
is
to
today's
everything.
Commander Institute colloquium, and what we're going to be doing today, today's theme is reconsidering the founders, and I originally said reconsidering the founders in the post-Hamilton age because of my obsession with bashing Hamilton, the music show.
Although we can also bash the guy.
You can bash the guy. That probably be better. But what we're going to be doing is taking maybe about 10 minutes apiece, maybe not quite that much in my case, and then we'll hope to have just then go into a general discussion with you in the audience of this theme of Within the Founders, but also of Woody's work, whatever else we happen to say. What I would do, thought I would do, is start by taking my 10 minutes to give both kind of an overview about what I was thinking when I think you kind of had the idea of this panel, and in the process kind of more properly introduce our speakers. And this, I don't know, I should have a name for this. This is like the Missouri Crisis books I just did. I really annoyed my co-editor by deciding that usually those kind of books you have an introduction where you talk about everybody's essays in order, and like that bores me. And it's like I always never want to read that part unless I'm not going to read the book. So I did this thing where I sort of had a theme and then I kind of worked them in as they came up. So that's what I'm going to try here, and we'll see how well it works out. So the question I start out with was, why do Americans claim so much to founders and foundings? And if you really start to think about it, it goes beyond just the founders that we tend to talk about at the Kinder Institute. It's just that whole concept. The business press, I think they have founders clubs, like in Silicon Valley. And of course it means the people who own all the stock, but I think it's kind of related in some weird way where it's like everyone wants to be a founder of something, and there's some notion that the person who wrote up the first document then imprints it mystically throughout time, no matter who owns it or happens to be there later. And one question we can debate is whether this is I don't know this is a uniquely American thing. Jay Sexton suggested this might be a uniquely anti-colonial thing. But I don't think it's something you see so much in Europe, this idea of there are national heroes, there are national myths, but the idea of people being so deeply invested in the people who started their country, and especially in following their thoughts and examples, either hyper positively as heroes or by the same token, hyper negatively as villains. I mean, I suppose Napoleon, King Arthur, they're heroes of some kind, but I don't know that they're as guides to life and politics and law in quite the same way. At least I hope there's no law cases that turn on the words of King Arthur. And I don't even think there are too many of that in France that turn on the words of Napoleon. Well, that's probably slightly more possible, and we can try to fill in all our own examples.
Sorry.
Is that coming out of the thing? No. Okay. Somebody's alarm. I could be wrong about that. In the U.S., though, we seem to be all about this. Founders as heroes and villains, sometimes to an obsessive and polarizing degree. And my question for us today is, what should historians and scholars do about it, if anything? Maybe we should accept it. Maybe we should stop fighting. Maybe we need to find the uses of it. I don't know. I hope that everyone here will have some things to say about that. And I feel Woody's book and Woody's lecture last night already did have some things to say about that question. What I thought I'd start out with was a little survey of the direction that this whole question of founders and hero worship has gone over just over my lifetime, going back a little bit before my scholarly lifetime into one's 70s childhood. And I guess my observation here is this seems to be getting worse rather than better, in the sense that American culture, when I was a kid, seemed to be more capable of nuance and realism about these things than we have increasingly been up to this day. And I don't know if it's going to work, but I don't know how many of you remember the bicentennial minutes that they show. I know there's some people of an age who they showed them of the correct age. They showed them on CBS every night at 9 o'clock for like a year and a half in 1975 and 76. And I remember them as being sort of, a lot of them kind of dark and disturbing, and where they actually go into real stories. They ended with "that's the way it was," and I feel like I learned a lot of things like this that you probably couldn't teach in a lot of schools now. And I looked one up, and I feel like I was, this is not a good research method, but if the first two things you come up with on Google confirm your thing you thought, then they must be right. So this is first mine. I have it in the browser. Give me two. Sorry, I'm in a weird mood today.
Sorry, this is a separate search.
YouTube, here we go. Just hit play in that YouTube video.
Okay.
I didn't realize we had.
And click share sounds too.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So just hit it. There you go.
I'm Gary Lockwood. 200 years ago today, loyalists of New York's Queens County waited in fear. Patriots were rifling through voting records, and anyone who dared to vote against the rebels in a recent election was marked for arrest. Congress had sent militiamen to check on rumors that the loyalists were smuggling in guns from British ships. Armed men went from house to house searching. They arrested 788 Queens County men and forced them to sign loyalty lists. 18 were taken to Philadelphia, where members of Congress could question them closely. But no real evidence was found. They were sent back to New York. Still, patriots kept them in jail for a month. The Tories were finally allowed to go home only after they paid heavy fines. I'm Gary Lockwood, and that's the way it was.
I remember.
Is CBS.
I'm sure you all recognize
Was it PBS?
No, CBS, network television, right? Probably
Yeah.
Annex came on right after that. Or Hawaii 5-0.
Right.
Wasn't that's the way it was?
That was Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, that's how he ended everything.
It was.
Okay.
It was. The point is, which we have like the patriot vigilantes jailing innocent citizens, fixing elections. It's quite a dark and stark scene where there's no heroes and no villains, and some scary stuff that was happening that he doesn't even bother to moralize about how it was necessary for, the way that one might. And I'm sure that there must have been some of those. The other one I watched had to do with how Thomas Jefferson got all of his best ideas from George Mason in the Declaration of Independence. So it was actually Jordan, it was nicer than that, but it was Thomas Jefferson stole all his best ideas from George Mason. We could be more. It seemed like we could be more calm. That we could be more nuanced. Even popular culture could be more realistic, and I felt that comes out of the scholarship too. Bicentennial scholarship spawned complex debates over the intellectual and social origins of the revolution. By then, the so-called NeoProgressive history of revolutionary politics, from the bottom up, calling more attention to the roles of crowds and protesters and social rebels, what they used to call the masses of the common man, that was well established by then. It was moving on It was moving beyond that in the 70s too. The bicentennial era produced landmark works like Gary Nash's Red, White, and Black from 1974, Mary Beth Norton's Liberty's Daughters, 1980, which two of the early books that went into I don't know that they were controversial at the time, but the idea that the revolution had costs, that women were involved in the revolution, there were all kinds of other social changes, both negative and positive. Even what we would now see as the more traditional kind of scholarship on the ideas of the revolution, produced by people like Bernard Bail and Gordon Wood, and Woody's friend, Woody's good friend. And there are many disciples and imitators, at least as it was read then, it had an edge to it. Quite a bit of the message of that scholarship was that the revolution was not altogether driven by the Lockean liberal, individualist, and egalitarian impulses that had long been assumed, right? I mean, that was, so it's hardly the sort of celebration that we might expect. That even the way certain people may talk there. Go on to the 1980s. I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a lit review. Sorry. So I'm trying to calm the waters with a lit review. The 1980s brought the bicentennial Constitution. The other bicentennial, which didn't get on TV as much. But it produced quite an efflorescence of scholarship, increasingly, especially about the Constitution, but I think about the founding more generally, but also brought along an increasingly adulatory tone. This is when the scholarly term changed to founders from founding fathers. Less patriarchal, but if you think about it, also far more pretentious and far more applicable and carrying far greater implications than this group of historical figures. I mean, I've kind of changed my mind about this. I still say founders, but I remember switching to founders, and then I kind of realized that probably makes a lot of the issues worse. And the original intent of the founders, of course, became a major concern in the 80s in law and politics because of some, starting with a speech by Reagan's Attorney General. With historians, of course, following in the wake of all that, trying to contextualize the founders and tell the original constitutional originalists that they were wrong. A very memorable book for me, something this is now by the time I'm in grad school, Jack Rako's Original Meanings being a landmark there. The 80s also, one of the things that happens over the course of all this is that as you get the founders, the lineup changes according to the needs of the time, or according to the emphasis of the time. The 80s kind of saw the rise of James Madison, who was certainly there before, but father of the Constitution, and Madison as a near equal of the other figures who have DC monuments and popular house museums that Madison at the time didn't have. When you first went to Madison does have a nice house museum now, but when you first go to it when I first went to it in the 90s, much earlier, it was actually Randolph Scott's house. And and it was actually done up more as Randolph Scott's house. That they kind of said, oh, so James Madison lived here. Here's all these pictures of Randolph Scott, the old cowboy star from Virginia, for those of you, again, you also don't remember. If you remember the Bicentennial Minute, you might remember Randolph Scott. This also saw, though, and this is very important for a lot of the founders' discourse later, is this is the period when you started to see the completion of the so-called papers projects. That is to say, the mass publication in book form, it was then considered to be easy book form of the papers of Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton. Those things had all started back in the 50s, or sometime back in the 50s, but by the 80s they were becoming completed. There was another thing called the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution that was very important. And of course, what these books did by collecting all these, I mean, admittedly, it's not a few annotated books, it's more like a few hundred annotated books. But like, one bank of shelves in the library, you could pretty much read everything there was to read on the ratification of the Constitution, on various founders, all the letters to inform them. And what that did, of course, is made it easy for lots of people to write about the founders. Like the whole wave of founder biographies that come later to me aren't possible without all the work that scholars did. I mean, it's one of those ironies. Scholars did all the work so that Dave McCullough and Ron Chernow could come make all the money later, right? Hopefully Woody's going to get his share. These debates over the ideas and the influences of the founders continue to develop, especially in the worlds of intellectual history, constitutional law, and political thought from the 80s to the present day. And our distinguished faculty fellow, Alan Gibson, has two great books following these debates: Understanding the Founding. This is the part where I'm getting the introductions, right? Understanding the Founding, the crucial questions, Interpreting the Founding, guide to the enduring debates of the origins and foundations of the American Republic. Alan taught for many years at Chico State University in California, and we're glad that he's decided to quote unquote retire here in Missouri. And continue teaching and having to go to things like this at the Kinder Institute. So we're very glad to have Alan with us, especially for a day like today. Unfortunately, the types of works that Alan has pondered are not necessarily the ones that have dominated our cultural discourse about the founders. That would be the trend towards hero worship and biographies, which didn't actually start. I think if you look at this, I mean, people have always published biographies. Readers love biographies, and their biographies are great. But there was a particular trend that seemed to have something to do with baby boomers remembering their fathers. Remember Tom Brokaw's Greatest Generation and the World War II era biographies. And David McCullough at first, before he got into John Adams, wrote a Truman biography. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote all of her Kennedy and Roosevelt stuff. And Stephen Ambrose, who wrote an early Republic book, also mostly wrote about Cold War presidents. So what seems to me is that trend of best-selling biographies about great American leaders in the recent past then kind of migrates, probably with the aid of the papers projects, kind of migrates into the founding right around the turn of the century through works like McCullough's Adams, Walter Isaacson's Franklin, Joseph Ellis's works, and definitely not least here in Missouri, Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage about Lewis and Clark, leading into one of the most purely adulatory bicentennial commemorations of my life, the one that caused me to have to fact check an opera that was commissioned by the University of Missouri. That was one of my first things. That was the year I was up for tenure here, 20 years ago. And they were nice guys. It was like the opera guy from Memphis, and a country singer who'd written hits for Charlie Pride, country songwriter who'd written hits for Charlie Pride in the 70s, who was now in the opera game, which would. You wouldn't have thought that. It was kind of cool. It had this whole song.
Charlie Pride, by the way. I just write about it. Hello,
yeah, we're getting lots of. We got Charlie Pride, Randolph Scott, Bicentennial.
Can I interrupt your?
You may. You may.
When my father was governor of Virginia, he had one state trooper. Now they all have up to 20. He had one state trooper who was just like 7 foot tall, tough, short-haired, former military, white state trooper who's introduced us kids to country music, and his favorite musician, this is in 1970, was Charlie Pride. Who was African American, for those of you who don't know. I think he did more for civil rights than Will and Grace did for decades.
Actually, have any opinion on the mutual the debate between Charlie Pride and Will and Grace. Modern rights movements. I'm right, I have no opinion. I'm almost done, but hey, Woody got some bio in there, so I'll mention it. Turn of the century also brings us to Woody Holton, because at the time when this sort of best founder, bestseller trend was coming in, it was also at the time when there were some then younger academic historians who were trying to push beyond the founders in various ways, or at least get through at least try to change some of this discourse. While others of us were just trying to widen the picture a bit, bringing in some of the middling elements of society, or find some talking about politics from a broader perspective than just sort of what the founders thought. Woody was out, and here's why I found this copy of Woody's first book, Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia from 1999, which is a kind of, this was confirmed at lunch. I wasn't sure whether I was allowed to call you a neo-progressive or a neo-prog, but you said it yourself. So it's a kind of return to the though an attempt to return on and improve the original sort of 60s history from the bottom up, not just by kind of expanding the roster, but also actually giving some causal roles to enslaved people, to the Indigenous peoples, and to the poor people poor whites who were also the stars of his. I guess they're sort of all the stars of your second book, Unruly Americans. All of which won an incredible number of awards. I mean, Woody's awards are amazing. The Merle Curtis, the finalists for the National Book Board and the George Washington Book Prize, all kinds of state and local prizes. Then, of course, for his Abigail Adams book, the Bancroft Prize. I guess since we're in this cultural nostalgia thing, I was most impressed by all your book club selections. By all those book clubs that I forgot existed, that as a person with lots of books, and those of you guys have seen my office, it's like I was a member of the Quality Paperback Book Club, and the History Book Club, and the Book of the Month Club. So that was actually probably the most impressive thing.
And none of which market the original book. They all go through their own printing, inferior quality. So,
well, I have the original quality. I think by that time I wasn't doing book clubs anymore. But here's what I was leading up to, which is that you have to say that Woody wrote these books with all kinds of awards, but you'd have to say that Forced Founders and Beyond Founders and all the rest of us, the one that I co-edited, and all the rest of us, totally failed to end this hero worship or its cousin demonization as the dominant modes of approaching the founders, and maybe certainly the most widely read way of approaching early American history. As early American historians and American culture took the historical legacy of slavery and racism, more and more slavery, the lineup changes. Thomas Jefferson fell into some disrepute, but David McCullough and later Ron Chernow were there to replace our old Southern hero with Northern ones, chiefly by exaggerating certain aspects that appealed to modern sensibilities. Because I mostly remember from David McCullough's wonderfully written book was what a wonderful relationship that John and Abigail had, but also that John Adams had some anti-slavery moments, mixed in with his racist moments. Anti-slavery credentials were inflated. Hamilton was remade as an immigrant, whatever that meant, in a society entirely made up of colonists. Come the Obama year, the Hamilton musical completes the process by casting Black and Latinx actors in a largely traditional story of military heroism and male angst, which then somehow becomes modernized, even though it's not modernized at all. It's just differently dressed. Of course, here in Missouri, we're still back on Jefferson, and George Washington, Virginia's largest slaveholder, never went anywhere. Present-day controversies, while more bitter, strike me chiefly as another step into the melodramatic universe of good and evil, rather than historical reason, the logical extension of the flight from complexity toward mutually antagonistic moralisms that we've been on from the days of the bicentennial, from the time this adulation trend started, someplace back in the 1980s. So, Aaron, I'll say something about I'll say something about you before you start. But that's all. I think that's enough for me. I would like to turn it over to Woody Holton.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful, and I often tell people this, and it just make me feel good. But this is not to make me feel good. I would like you to email me what you wrote there, because I thought that was a lot.
Okay, well, if I can remember it 5 minutes later.
Yeah,
it's actually written down.
You said you were just going to introduce us. There was a lot there. The one thing that wasn't there was the comparison between your period that you know the best. I know you're now an expert on 1820, but you're the guy on the 1790s. And isn't that the period that we're living through now?
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to ask you about that later. Don't talk. Put that on the back burner. So I tell my students, I'm sure I'll get a dispute with this later, about the worst way to organize a paper. So the bottom finger is by source. I read these letters and found this. I read this story, found that. So don't organize your paper by source. That's the worst way. The second worst way is chronologically, straight narrative. For instance, the way I organize my book in chronological order. That's the second worst way, because it's merely a story and not argument. Third worst, or the second best, or third worst way is topical. And then the best way, it sounds like topical, but it's different, is you've come up with your own arguments and you organize it around your own arguments. Those are the other things. I say there are exceptions to this. For instance, when you are introducing a panel, you can just organize it by source. That is, we're going to introduce Aaron, and then Woody, and then Alan. But of course, Jeff has shown that it's possible to organize even an introduction of his fellow panelists topically, or shall I say, by his own arguments. That's the top line for me. And I really appreciate it, especially what you said at the beginning about the bicentennial. I remember them vaguely, but I didn't remember the edge that you revealed there. I did remember, as I bet some of the other people here do, because it also got made into a movie, 1776. How many people have seen either the movie or the play? 1776. Guys, show up in. So maybe slightly less than half. Now, here's why I mentioned it, because one of my teaching assistants and PhD advisees at South Carolina recently published a piece that I recommend to you in the Washington Post. His last name is Clary, C-L-A-R-Y. Anybody wants to Google or search in the Washington Post pages for it, because you will like it, Jeff, because he makes the case that 1776 is much edgier than Hamilton.
Well, no, I agree.
You talked about it.
We talked. That is one of the things we talked about last night.
Yes, we did. I totally remember.
That's all right.
But my student's point was, now, the fact of having a mostly people of color cast obviously makes Hamilton cool, and the music is better, not only by our standards, but by any standards, I think. But I mean, I memorized 1776 as a kid. I think it really influenced me. But it was edgier on a couple of issues. One, it was anti-war. It came out right after the Vietnam War. The war was really winding down. And you remember that song? It was beautiful. What I, as a Southerner, liked the most was molasses and rum to slaves. Because you can watch Hamilton and think of slavery as a Southern problem. You can't watch 1776 and delude yourself in that way, because even though he's the bad guy, Rutledge, who sings that song, is reminding us that Rhode Island was as dependent on slavery as Virginia or South Carolina.
And they all back off in the shows.
That's right, and they take out, which of course is that was one of the things in the show that was literally true.
Right.
so radical was 1776 that when they did their show at the White House, I'm sorry to say, my father was a Republican governor, not too far from Washington, so we could have been invited for that. We weren't. So actually, Mom and Dad invited the cast of 1776 to our house, and they put on the show in Richmond. And I have an autograph book full of the signatures of all of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and they all learned how to sign their name, to look like John Hancock and Jefferson and all that. But when it was shown at the White House, my student discovered, Nixon had some changes he wanted to make. And the two songs that I just mentioned, he demanded be cut. And that went back and forth and ended up actually showing, winning against Nixon and singing the whole show. But he had a friend, I think it was MGM, I can't remember who made the movie. But when they made the movie, they cut out cool conservative men. And that's at the instigation of Richard Nixon. He just called up his buddy, who was the manager. Fortunately, somebody, and I don't understand, I thought they only put LDS church birth records in Salt Mountains, but somebody had put that in the mountain. And so when they came up with the DVD in like 2002, out came the originals from the mountain. And they put that song back into the movie. So I'm watching on DVD now.
I think we have the DVD up on the shelf there, y'all.
Yeah. But if you watch it on VHS, as I did in the 90s, you can see that. But so I'm just saying that to reinforce your point that people got away with more then than they do now. So I think what we're describing right now, what we're living in right now, is a backlash, where even the criticisms that one could make of the founders, just to make your show more interesting, but also to make a statement against the Vietnam War on civil rights, as they did in 1776. Stuff that didn't used to be controversial is today. There's a protectiveness about the founders that didn't exist before. And so I think that is a subset of a larger backlash that we're living through. He mentioned my favorite book about women in the Revolutionary era, Liberty's Daughters, by Mary Beth Norton. The most recent big one that writes about women in general is also the most grim, and it's by our friend Rosemary Zagari, and it's called Revolutionary Backlash. And you get about 20 pages, a little bit more at the beginning about the front lash. One of my favorite parts of it is a chapter describing women of the colonial era who refer to themselves as politicians, not in the modern sense of making a career of it, but you translate politician into policy wonk, right? But a lot of women describe themselves as politicians in the 1770s because there was a revolution going on, and that women were about that. But that little tiny front lash, one of the states, New Jersey in 1776, as many of you know, enfranchised free women who owned a certain amount of property, meaning they weren't married because you didn't have any when you were married. That tiny little front lash produced a huge backlash against women. Free blacks had voted in many states and lost the vote in the 19th century, even as more and more poor whites gained it and didn't have a property qualification for voting by the Jackson era, majority of the non-southern states at least. And so I would like to, I said before that I wanted to call on you at some point in this discussion to compare the 1790s political situation to now. In terms of the intensity of the conflict, people are getting hurt, and people got hurt in the 1790s. There were fist fights, brawls on the streets of Philadelphia, as you and David Waldstreicher and others more recently have written about. And that sounds a lot like now. There's no January 6th movement in the 1790s, but there's a lot of brawls. As we talk about the people who dared to criticize the founders in the old days, let's say the 1960s, I want to quote one of them. Some of you are going to think I have a personal obsession here as I quote this person. But here's what one of the radicals wrote in 1969 about the U.S. Constitution. He said, it was intrinsically an aristocratic document designed to check the democratic tendencies of the period. This same radical wrote 11 years later, in 1980, at the end of this period of efflorescence in the 60s and 70s, radical thought about the founding. He wrote, the Federalists did seek to cover their aristocratic document with a democratic mantle. I would defy you to find anything more negative about the founders in my book, Unruly Americans. My friend Mike Klarman produced a book called The Framers' Coup, and I thought that went too far because they did get these ratifying conventions to approve it, by some skullduggerous methods, but they did. So guess who that radical person wrote the calling an aristocratic document with a democratic mantle was?
Gordon Wood.
It was Gordon Wood. It was Gordon Wood. So if you're comparing our era to the bicentennial era in the life of the nation, I wonder whether we also just need to talk about the life of the historians. That is that Gordon Wood maybe didn't have a mortgage in 1969 or something. And I'll say also personally, autobiographically, I think that I think this is a less political book than the ones I wrote before. Not because I was trying to appeal to get some of that David McCulloch money, although if that works out, that's fine too. But because Bob Gross said something very interesting to me once, which you wrote Men in Their World and just brought out Transcendentalists in Their World. Bob is a very productive author. He brings out a book every 50 years, whether it's needed or not, and it's worth the wait. Between Minute and which has been assigned, I think. I mean, I know he sold like 300,000 copies, so that means that it's just been assigned every year in many people's classes, including mine. And Transcendentalists I had read is fantastic too. Bob said, I don't know how we got into this game of playing who's more radical, you or me. And I said, well, I'm for abolishing SUVs or something like that. And he says, okay, you may be more politically radical than me, but I'm more intellectually radical. And I think that's true. That is, at some point, you could argue that intellectual radicalism requires you to abandon your flag, whether it's a red flag or a red, white, and blue flag. And so I focused last night on the role of Native Americans and African Americans, women, and then I did a little bit of military strategy. And somebody asked me a question that I finally got to sneak in. Someone might talk about the influence of disease on the course of the revolution. A couple of other scholars have written about it. McNeil, and I'm forgetting who wrote, Peter McCandless, about the wars in the South and how disease was affected. I thought they did great foundational work, but I think they're totally wrong. So I had my own angle on disease and on, why Cornwallis went to Virginia in 1781 and ended up at Yorktown and, signing the surrender that ended the war. Why did he go to Virginia? Because it has fat rivers that are deep enough and for navigable, for a warship to sail up, more importantly for a supply ship to sail up, and they're fat enough that a shore battery can't stop one of those ships from going by. They're like the Hudson in that respect. And North Carolina doesn't, South Carolina doesn't. And so he wanted to get to a place where he could be supplied, and that was Virginia. And the rest, what's the line? The rest, that's the way it was.
That's the way it was.
October 19th, 1781. So anyway, I'm writing about all this other stuff. And so one could easily say I've sold out from writing this heavy-handed class analysis in Forced Founders to Unruly Americans. See, he's moving away from me even now because I'm such a sellout. But I think it's worth studying how people evolve over their lifetime. And if I didn't have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, I'd say, people like you and me probably need to get out of the way. Okay. I'm not asking for a comment. But I want to say my quick word about the founders, since that is what I'm supposed to be talking about. Can't wait to hear from Alan and Aaron. So I spoke at Truman State 2 nights ago and had an amazing discussion with their classicist, Josh Nudell, who was he had been reading all about the Rwandan genocide, even though his specialty is ancient Greece, because the Greeks had taken over an island called Samos, and either had or hadn't massacred the elite of that island. And that was much contested over the next 50 or 100 years. And he had something very complicated about how no one claimed they had at first, but then Alexander came and conquered Athens and the rest of Greece. And so it became useful to say, oh yes, it's a good thing Alexander came. He's liberating us all from those horrible Athenians. But he thinks that's not actually true. And I said, did it really help you to read all this stuff about Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda? He said, absolutely, I couldn't have written this article. My point is, responding to the first thing you said, yes, I think we are uniquely obsessed with founders, but I'm stating an obvious point when I say a lot of other places are obsessed with their founders too. There's a person I keep accidentally referring to as Simone de Beauvoir, but I think his real name is Simone Bolivar, of several states, nations on the northern coast of South America. And I think you would have the same problem criticizing Bolivar in Colombia or Venezuela as you might having criticizing Washington here. Although none of this compares to criticizing Robert Burns in Scotland, which I would never dare to do. So I think we all have our founders that people are sensitive about. I certainly think they're more sensitive in some eras than others, and we're the peak moment of it. But I want to add to that, since I mentioned Simone Bolivar, that I've been astonished at how many of the world's current countries, we all have some kind of, even Canada, we all have some kind of founding moment, but Canada is one of the few exceptions to the next thing I'm going to say, which is that almost all of our founding moments are revolutions. Even England goes back to 1688 and their glorious revolution. They're proud of how nonviolent it was. French are sometimes proud of how violent theirs was. But almost all of the African countries are defined by their colonial war India, China, of course, against their form of colonialism. I was on an academic junket to Vietnam once, and I met a man who spoke decent French, and I didn't, so I can't vouch for what I'm saying to you, but it was the only language that we could speak in. And he was in charge of cleaning the hotel. I was a very old man. And he said, I participated in the fight against the Japanese when the Japanese were here in Vietnam. And then the French. That's where I learned French. And then he sort of looked back and said, you guys. And then the Chinese, and reminded me that there had been a war between China and Vietnam, a border war, because that was in northern Vietnam after that. And so there's a country that's really defined by its revolution because it's had to have so many of them just to be to the extent that it is in the nation today. And so I know that Jordan is writing about the history of the revolution. I really want people doing that, people thinking about monuments as Aaron Holmes has done a lot here, and a lot of you guys have here, to study how other people have handled things like their Jefferson statues, because I think people are coming up with ways of representing complexity. And I think it would be an amazingly heroic moment. You had your big reveal. I'm going to put up my big reveal. Will you put up that slide that I emailed over to you, Aaron? Here's what I think you should do at your Jefferson monument. Titus Kaffar produced a painting that we're going to show you in a second. And there's a big dispute in New York City right now about whether to take down the Jefferson statue in New York City Hall. And they have voted to take it down. I think they're talking about putting it over to the New York Historical Society so it can be properly contextualized. What's that? With all the glaring each other. But those guys win. If we talk about Hamilton fighting Jefferson, then we lose because that's not the big battle. But so this is a painting that hung at one point at National Portrait Gallery. I'm not sure where it is today, but you see how that's Jefferson. It's been folded back. And what I love about the African American woman's expression, she's not glaring. She's certainly not happy either. she's just looking. And so if I were on New York City Hall, the New York City Council, this is what I would propose. Leave the statue of Jefferson up, but put this hanging over it and set up a spectrum between Jefferson's ideals and Jefferson's reality. And I think we are complex enough as humans. We've reached a level of development where we can have monuments that are spectrums and not just a hero context.
Okay. Well, we tried that.
Yeah, I know.
Hanging up Wendy Collins?
Yeah, oh, she read me, but she wanted to play there, and it was beautiful and also as inoffensive as you could possibly be.
As we could possibly be.
And-
While
and
still
the whole
describing the reality.
thing is much more elaborate as well.
Okay, thank you, Woody.
So I'm honored to be on this panel. It's really important for me and nice for me also to get to renew my spirited friendship with Woody Holton. Yeah, we go back. The last time I saw you was maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and so your son was just born, and you were talking about him then, and you're talking about him now. So that's a wonderful thing. I just wanted to say too that last night just showed me again how much energy and humor and good cheer you bring into a room, and it's. You have lucky students. Congratulations to them and to you for that. So the only thing I want to start with is just some kind of possible modification, not a whole lot of what Jeff was saying in the introduction. And I fundamentally agree that we still pay an undue attention to the American founders compared to other nations in particular. But what has happened more recently, I would say, and
He's just gonna close the door.
that's fine. And what has happened is the introduction of the founders into the cultural wars. I think we're back. We're past the moment of Hamilton. We're past the moment of Founders Chic, the 2003 article in the Atlantic that kind of laid out all of the books that we're selling and the celebratory biographies that Jeff pointed to. I think we're back past both those moments, and we seem to be in a moment where how you feel about the founders is a cultural cue in the culture wars. It's something along the lines of, you can tell something about somebody's position on X, Y, and Z if you see it on A. Anyway. I think that's where we're at, but I fundamentally agree, and I think this is the central problem we face, that we're locked into a kind of battle between people who celebrate the American founders and those who excoriate them. It's between groups I would call prosecutors on the one hand and vindicators on the other, people who put the founders on a pedestal, the others who knock them off the pedestal. And so one thing I'll say, before I elaborate on those groups and how we might get out of that, and that's really what I want to talk about most, is that I don't regret the fact that we have moved away from celebratory founding, or essentially celebratory founding. It was long overdue, and we owe the respect for what people in what we call now marginalized groups or people other than the elite founders, even ordinary white men in the revolution did. We were long past where we should take account of that. And also take account, as Woody's scholarship really subtly does, of showing how the people outdoors affect what goes on indoors as well. I think those are both really fundamentally important things to do. So I wouldn't go back there, but I would point out that we're giving up something. So one of the things is, why do we have this special moment? Why do we worship the founders, or at least gravitate toward them? The line I would use for that is, a mongrel nation needs a founding moment. We are a very diverse group of people. We have in the past centered upon the founding as a moment to create unity. We're losing that moment. We have lost that moment as a moment to go back to create unity. Can we redo that in some way? Can we look, for example, at the aspirations of the founders rather than the founders as heroes in order to create the same unity we once had? even that's under fire now, and we need to think about that. So what I've really tried to do in one of my books, at least, which is called Understanding the Founding, is to say how some things about what it might mean to break out of that cycle of celebration and condemnation, how we might do it. This is not something, incidentally, I'm going to say there are 3 things that you can do here. This has about the same value as a PowerPoint does, right? I mean, this is going to be rendering a grape into a raisin. There's no set of bullet points here that can establish what I mean by understanding founding. It is a sensibility, a way of thinking about the founding that I'm striving to convey, and also to urge upon you, because I think it provides, well, at least will provide some good spirit in conversations with regard to the divisiveness that we now have in so many different areas that's reflected in our different disagreements about the founding. At any rate, the first thing I would say is that understanding the founding depends foundationally upon a deep immersion into the foreign world of the founder and a knowledge of the particular and often peculiar assumptions of the ideas underlying the founders. Have to take a drink, excuse me. Okay, that's much better. At any rate, so I don't have to tell this room that that's all Bernard Bailyn all day long, right? And Bailyn added to that this proposition that we shouldn't anticipate our world when investigating, thinking about theirs. We shouldn't anticipate that they knew how the story was going to turn out. We shouldn't anticipate that they understood the assumptions that we would be using to judge them. One of the things that's most interesting about that to me with regards to the founders is they were deeply immersed in the concept of fame. This is something that Doug Sedaris showed a long time ago in some really penetrating essays. And what they meant by fame, they were immensely concerned with their view of the peers that they had in their lifetime, had of them and those kinds of things. But they were talking about fame as the eventual opinion that posterity would have for them. So one of the things that leads me, especially when you're thinking of the issue of slavery, to think that we're judging the founders in a way they did not judge themselves, is if they would have thought that slavery was going to lead to their infamy, which it is now in some quarters doing, then I think they would have been far more serious about doing something about it. Okay, and it would be something more than conditional abolitionism, and with the conditions for abolition never taking place, never really having the possibility of taking place. So anyway, that's an example just of how we might, take the assumptions that they have. So we need historical thinking. We need Bailyn's axiom, and we need Bailyn's army. Okay, we need Gordon Wood, Jack Rakoff, Michael Zipperman, Jeff Paisley. Jeff did not pay me to say
Wait a
minute. Anyway, we need to first come to terms with their intellectual universe. One of the classes I get to teach here in the Kinder Institute, which I just salivated when I heard the title for it, the possibility of getting to teach this. It's called The Intellectual World of American Founding. I mean, this is absolutely my wheelhouse, okay? It's something I really enjoy. It put together this constellation of complex ideas that they had in play, and trying to figure out how they where they went, and what problems they solved for them. All these different things are part of that class for me. Secondly, I think that to achieve a proper understanding of the founding, we definitely need to adopt, as Woody suggested, I think a complex and detached view of the founders that allows us to confront them in all of their moral ambiguity. Independent of romanticism and puerile hero worship on the one hand, and self-righteous acontextual condemnation on the others. We ought by now to be beyond simplistic celebrations of the founding elite So the big six, Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, Hamilton, and Washington, are the ones that are usually in people's minds when they're talking this way. We ought to be beyond that. I mean, spoiler alert, the elite did not turn out to be an elect. But more controversially, and this is something I want to direct to Woody, I would argue we need the same detached stance and also commitment to truth when we spread out the inquiry, as we should, following Woody Holton, to the non-elite founders. We also need to realize that when we're interpreting them as well, that we're interpreting flawed human beings because there's no other kind of human being. And I say this with a bit of trepidation, but we're going to run into things even when with the people that we have previously been silenced, who we're now putting on the table to see as heroes, as people who should be celebrated and were celebrated, as were forgotten in their time, were silenced. We're going to see divisions among them that we don't expect. We're going to see actions from them that we can't necessarily valorize. If we are willing to confront the complexity of the founding, we need to confront it with real authenticity and complexity that looks at those people in a particular way as well. I was watching you last night, and I just realized. So you're 100% historian and a brilliant one, an accomplished one at that, as Jeff has established in his introduction. But you're also part evangelist and something of a motivator as well. I was ready to sign up last night after that thing. Just point me in the right direction. Tell me where to hit, coach. That kind of thing. But that it's the narrative itself can be a how do I want to put this? It can be true in every component of it, and not the whole truth. If the stories themselves are taken selectively, and if we only tell the celebratory story of the ground up scholarship as well, then we haven't, in fact, transcended the pedestal and knocking people off of it. We're still in a cycle of condemnation and celebration. So a third thing that I will say with regard to the founding, it's one of the things that people do. Well, let me put it bluntly first. We should differentiate understanding the founding from exploiting and appropriating the founding. Doing what Gordon Wood, your friend Gordon Wood, calls ransacking history. We shouldn't be ransacking history, quite obviously. You can see the negative language of that. But you would be amazed how much scholarship on the American founding is an attempt to either say something like, here's an idea from the past that we should now employ directly, okay? They thought of things in a way that we should think of them. Some of it, in its most puerile form, is virtually a good old days narrative. It is let's return to the good old days. There is a quip about the good old days that Steven Pinker is throwing around these days. I want to get this right, so give me just a second here. Anyway, it's something like the easiest path to the good old days is a bad memory. And I think it's a really good line to think about when we do this. We also, these kinds of appropriations also are extremely simplistic sometimes, whether they identify a problem, then say something like, well, contemporary American democracy is dysfunctional because the founders started us off on the wrong path. The founders didn't understand democracy. They established an undemocratic political system. Therefore, we inherit that undemocratic system. Well, you know what? We had 220-something years now between those two things. We could have done something about that already, okay? And this is one of the things that I worry about with this kind of analysis. there's a certain degree of irony in what I'm saying because I'm appropriating a founder to make this point. But the earth really does belong to the living. And part of what we need to do is to exercise our own agency. And we need a category, frankly, that is about the irrelevance of the founders. Okay? And you never hear anything like that because of the very kinds of things that we've been talking about. The irrelevance of the founders would say, quite obviously, circularly, they had nothing to do with this positively or negatively. Shut up. Okay? Let's talk about who we are and those kinds of things. We are defining, of course, who we are by how we orient ourselves toward the past and the founders. There's no doubt about that. But these are sort of some of the things that I think that we should do in order to move toward a mature understanding of the founding, underlying understanding, in order to begin the process of judging the founders and deciding how to introduce them into our own discourse, our own world. So those are, once again, with the caveat that that this is a very complex kind of question. It doesn't afford itself 3 bullet points, and I have done that. It's also the case that the approach that I'm outlining for you, as I said at the beginning, is a sensibility, and it isn't going to say anything concretely about whether or not we keep Jefferson or bid him adieu. It's going to provide us, I hope, with a way of thinking in a more mature way about the American founders and talking about them in a more sensible way. I hope that we can mature as a nation. James Madison said in the 49th Federalist Papers, "A nation of philosophers is not to be expected." Well, that's particularly true of America. And the questions that I'm hoping we can move toward these principles. I'm not confident that we can. This is one of the kinds of things that you need at precisely the moment when it's least available. Okay, but if it's going to happen, it ought to happen from universities. Universities need and institutions like this one. One of the things I love about the Kinder Institute, there are many things, but one of the things I love about the Kinder Institute is it is legitimately nonpartisan. It's not bipartisan, it's nonpartisan. Ideas really flow freely through here. People take different positions. They don't hold grudges. I just don't see anything like that around here. This is a free speech enclave. So I'm proud to be a part of it. Anyway, the things that I've said are not going to be, they're not going to have some immediate application. I'm asking Americans to come to a more mature resolution toward this particular group of people who we designate as particularly important and go from there.
I'm cheering up, Alex. For real. So Aaron Holmes, sorry, Aaron, you didn't fit into the historiography of the founding.
She will.
You will soon. But Aaron Holmes is completing her 3rd year as a Kinder Institute postdoctoral fellow, and Aaron was a student of Woody Holton's at University of South Carolina, which, of course, many reasons to bring Woody here, but that was definitely one of them. And Aaron, of course, actually studies material culture, plantation architecture, and politics of plantation architecture in South Carolina and Barbados. Probably didn't expect to have to be pulled into founder stuff, but she ended up at the Kinder Institute, and one thing led to another, and she found herself serving on doing some extremely stressful duties behind the scenes, though not, behind the scenes, but not without an audience. That she did incredibly well. But she will say Aaron is the only person on this whole. There was a committee. Let's just say there was a committee to contextualize the Jefferson statue, which you may notice It hasn't been contextualized. Having talks up here is pretty much the amount of contextualization that's probably going to be occurred. And the committee that involved like monthly Zoom meetings, and I'll say Erin is like the only person who kept her head during the whole time. So it's like the fact that we all got through it, and I mean, Gary Kramer, the chair, I have to say, but between you and Gary, you're the only two that didn't like embarrass yourself at one point. At one point or the other.
Academics, that's a pretty big compliment.
Yeah, no, it is a huge compliment. It's a huge compliment. And Erin's also been involved in some other. She's done a lot of work, tried to work with historic preservation on campus, especially the effort to try to document. To document and promote the history of what we call the historic women's campus over the Gothic side of campus, or the history department, where the perhaps soon to be ex-history department building is. Erin's has helped us learn all kinds of things about that. And I'm not sure it'll help in the end, but at least it'll help with knowing what was there. So we appreciate Erin for that and for all kinds of other things that she's done. And now I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was a very generous introduction. And I always expect to have to talk about the founders. And in fact, Woody may remember from my dissertation having to explain why I was talking so much about Monticello and Mount Vernon to the exclusion of a lot of other places, why they had such a prominent role in talking about the architecture of plantations in this period, when they're exceptional in most ways, and not just in who lived in them, but in how they were built and what they were intended to say. I am so excited, like Alan, to be on this panel of really august figures, and I am going to do something that I promised myself I wouldn't do before this, and show my age. Which is to say, Alan's comments in particular, thinking about the complexity, make me think of a phrase that is, I don't know if it's a millennial phrase or a Gen Z phrase. Someone in the audience can correct me if it is not a millennial thing. That all your faves are problematic, right? All your faves are problematic.
Faves, you're saying faves?
Yeah, all your faves.
faves.
Yeah, all your faves. All your favorites. But it sounds better to say all your faves are problematic. Anyways, all your faves are problematic, and in advocating for acknowledging the complexity of these figures, I come back time and time again to saying to people, you don't really like the history of this period. You don't really like the history of this person or the history of this founder if all you want to talk about is the myth. If all you want to talk about is half the story, because I don't think any of us in our daily lives or in any of our interactions go around like wishing that we could make everybody perfect versions of themselves and cut out all the parts that we don't like, because those are the parts that shape everything else. And so when it comes to each of the founders, I can honestly say that there's something about each of them that I really admire, if not personally connect to. But there's also something that I can quote you line and verse on about where they were very wrong on a particular issue or a particular interpretation, though I guarantee you that everyone on this panel can quote that line and verse better than I can. And so in the interest of not digressing too much, because I see a number of students in the audience who have taken classes with me and therefore know how distractible I am, I did do a PowerPoint. Or have a PowerPoint. And I wanted to start off, I have 3 points to make. And the first one allows me to start off by talking about one of my kind of favorite forgotten founders. And that's this guy, Charles Thompson. Thompson is an Irish immigrant. He is really incredibly passionate about the revolutionary cause. He also hates England because he's Irish in the 18th century, which is enough of a justification. But Charles Thompson is one of those figures who's present for a lot of really important moments. And because of his presence, because he often ends up taking copious notes, we know a lot about those moments that we might not know otherwise. Thompson is described by John Adams as the Sam Adams of Philadelphia. He's a radical member of the Sons of Liberty. And during first the Continental Congress, and then the Constitutional Convention, he's gonna serve as the secretary through all of this. So he's the guy who takes the notes. And even while doing this job, he gets into fights with all of them that sometimes are actual physical fist fights on the floor, including with allies of John Adams, who he and John Adams had issues. But Thompson is going to play a really key role all through this period. And then in 1789, he hands over the Great Seal, which he played a role in designing, to his successor, and he steps away, essentially saying he's done with this process. And so he spends the rest of his life focused on scientific pursuits. But one of the things that he does, besides beekeeping, is write a 1,000-page history of the Revolution. This is the guy who kept the notes on the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention. Like, this is the guy who didn't just know where the bodies were buried, he buried them, to steal a phrase that Woody used yesterday when we were chatting. And Thompson makes the decision ultimately to burn his 1,000-page history of the Revolution. Before I continue in this serious vein, because I should have done this first, I wanted to share this portrait of Thompson, mostly to give you a face to associate with who I'm talking about, but also because every time I look at it, any Parks and Rec fans reminded of the similarity between Charles Thompson and Martin Kernston, the Nipple King of Pawnee. That's so real. Anybody else? Right? So haircuts stick around. Cultural things stick around. But when he's talking about his destruction of this history, Thompson is going to be quoted saying, "I should contradict all the histories of the great events of the Revolution. Let the world admire the supposed wisdom and valor of our great men. Perhaps they may adopt the qualities that have been ascribed to them, and thus good may be done. I shall not undeceive future generations." Which kind of leads me to my first point, which is that a lot of times when we get critiques of the founders, it's on the basis that, well, in their own time, this was acceptable. In their own time, they were men of their time. But the abolitionist movement begins at the end of the 17th century. There are people talking about how slavery is wrong long before Thomas Jefferson is even born. And I think we can read in Jefferson's own writings that he knows that slavery is wrong. And so we're not judging them exclusively by the morals of our time, but we are talking about how to make this past usable, right? How do we think about this idea that in their own time these things would be acceptable? Charles Thompson thinks all of these guys are trash in one way or another. He also is the guy who, again, kept the notes. And those notes are where so many historians have drawn these really kind of heroic portrayals of these debates and these ideological discussions. These notes provide a really valuable source for talking about the great things that these founders have done. Which brings me to my second point, the word great. Great's a problematic word, and it means it's changed its meaning over time. Usually today, when we talk about something being great, it automatically means it's also good, right? But great just means important, impactful. And great things are often terrible things. And that's something that we have to reckon with. These great things that the founders achieved are very frequently things that have really negative ramifications. And so we have to think about when we use the word great, which, when we think about historiography, I am not going to go into as deep a lit review as Jeff did, which was very helpful. But when we talk about historiography, right, the whole philosophy of the great men of history really solidifies in the 19th century. And it's this idea that you can understand history only by looking at the great men. This is a strategy historians have used since antiquity, but it's formalized in the 19th century. But the more we look at kind of the broad trends of history and the more we look at what we need in the present, we find that the questions that those historians were asking are not the questions that are useful to us today. They're not the questions that we need answers to. And so this idea that there is greatness, or that greatness is a synonym for good, I think is really something we need to move away from. And I really echo what Alan was saying, that we need to get rid of the pedestal altogether, right? We need to think really critically about the difference between remembering and celebrating, right? Because that's the challenge. Are we celebrating the person, or are we celebrating the ideas? Which brings me to my last point, and I think I'm going to be the briefest speaker because I really want to get to the Q&A, but enjoy the giant text box. They are both Jefferson quotations, and we know Jefferson never says anything briefly. They're from 1815 and 1816, and they build on the same point, which is that the past is not the present. The past shapes the present, but that, as he says in the second quotation, let's see, 2/3 of the adults then living are now dead. Have then the remaining third, even if they had the wish, the right to hold in obedience to their will and to laws heretofore made by them, the other 2/3, who with themselves compose the present mass of adults. If they have not, who has? The dead, but the dead have no rights. They are nothing. And he says this in his proposals to revise the Virginia Constitution. So this is not one of those things that is sort of a private conversation. The top letter is, and it's a letter in which Jefferson is justifying to John Vaughan, who's the secretary of the American Philosophical Society, his decision not to be president again. Jefferson serves as president of the APS for 17 years, before, during, and after his presidency. And he, at various points, says that it's one of the greatest honors of his life. And he writes in that first quotation, nothing is more incumbent upon the old. I will see if I can read this, because I did not realize that would be it. Hear me? Okay, thank you. Nothing is more incumbent on the old than to know when they should get out of the way and relinquish to younger successors the honors they can no longer earn and the duties they can no longer perform. I rejoice in the election of Dr. Wistar and trust that his senior standing in the society will have been considered as a fair motive of preference by those whose merits standing alone would have justly entitled them to the honor, and who as juniors, according to the course of nature, may still expect their turn. And the reason I included this one is that it leads us quite nicely to right here. I know also that the laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths are disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. And so you can see why I chose especially the second long one, because he has some really great quotations that we can pull out. But again, this brings me to that kind of discussion of these men in their own time, right? So as preoccupied as they are with their fame, and we know Jefferson was, right? He keeps copies of every single letter that he writes. He invents something that will help him do that more easily. They also have this awareness that these institutions aren't sacred. These institutions have to change. And that part of existing in a democracy and part of the democratic ideals that they do embrace, even if they don't necessarily want to enfranchise everybody, is that it rests on this tension between the left and the right, between conservatism and progressivism, between change and losing my train of thought, between change and standing still. And so I think it's really powerful for us to go back to what they say themselves. Again, thinking about that Jefferson is a problematic guy. Jefferson knows he's problematic in his own time, right? Just today in my discussion section, we were talking about the great quotation, I tremble that God is just. and that he won't sleep, knowing that that slavery is an injustice. He knows this is wrong. But it's one of those things that he himself has no solution to, or at least no solution that he can kind of live with. And this isn't necessarily a call to say that we forget these things, but that we don't make them the only thing that we remember. That we give them the kind of service or the kind of grace that we would ask for ourselves from the people around us. That, you know what, your worst moment is hopefully not the moment that you're remembered by. And so I think, again, like the others, I really want to call for greater complexity and greater immersion in this history, because if you really engage with it, you know that these people were conscious of their problems. You know that they were deeply imperfect, and what they accomplish is actually diminished if you put them up on a pedestal, if you insist that they are greater than human. And Jefferson even talks about this. At the beginning, he really covered everything. I appreciated it. Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. I knew that age well. I belonged to it and labored with it. It deserved well of its country. It was very like the reading, and this they would say of themselves were they to rise from the dead. I skipped one. But without, it was very like the present, but without the experience of the present. And 40 years of experience in government is worth a century of book reading. And this they would say themselves were they to rise from the dead. So again, they don't see themselves as these untouchable figures. And I think, to go back to Charles Thompson, who will always be my favorite person, and I really hope somewhere that copy didn't actually get burned. These guys were flawed, and we needed them as myths at the founding. They needed to be these mythical figures during that earliest period when we were kind of crafting a national identity. But identities change. Our understanding of who we are and what's important is going to change. And we're really doing them a disservice by imagining them as these godlike individuals who are incredibly wise and always correct. Because what they accomplish, some of those things are great, and I mean that in the sense of important and impactful. And it's more powerful that they're able to accomplish those things despite these really deep flaws, despite the fact that they are imperfect. And they have to reckon with this themselves and reckon with their own hypocrisy, right? And I will stop there because I feel myself going down a rabbit hole on all the ways Thomas Jefferson is a hypocrite. So I'm going to stop and let us get into Q&A.
2 minutes left. So who's got like the two best questions? That was the very best question. All right.
I'll own up to it.
All right. You got the best question.
Probably negative.
Guaranteed best question.
So, going back to something you said, Dr. Gibson, about, to paraphrase if I understood correctly, the need for a unifying sort of moment experience for a diverse nation. To really just bluntly ask the maybe $1 million question is, how do we do that? Like, how do we do that when, as Dr. Holton has written about, like there's these external factors that you can't really romanticize and don't paint this glowing picture. How do we contextualize, we talked about at the end, these factors into a unifying moment when it wasn't always unifying for everyone, I guess, for anyone else.
So the easiest answer to that is to say that we look at their aspirations rather than the concrete realities that they drew from the very principles that they articulated. So I would call this aspirational liberalism or something like that. Last night, Professor Holton said something that was stunning to me in some ways, but also that I fundamentally agree with, and that is that basically everything we need is in the Declaration of Independence. I don't know if that's too strong, but
I'll take that.
Okay. The founding ideas of the Declaration of Independence can be our guidance forward. I think they can be our unifying set of ideas from that moment. I don't think that moment in its historical reality can provide a unifying thread for very much. And I mean, one of the things about either drawing from the founders or not drawing from the founders is we should be very balkanized in our understandings with regard to that too, or just compartmentalizing them. James Madison was absolutely brilliant, and I mean brilliant democratic theorist. He was prescient in ways that people don't realize. He realized things about group dynamics. He's what is now called a choice architecture guy in a way that is extremely complex and interesting. He's not worth a dime when it comes to race relations. Okay, he doesn't have very much to say about that other than James, go away. You know, I mean, that's not really what I want to turn to him for. And so I think, you know, that idea of, you know, returning to them for guidance, if you even see that as the right thing to do, I do. I will say, and I want to make this itself truly authentic too, though, saying that I think there are a subset of progressives in America right now who've also given up upon aspirational liberalism. Okay, they believe that aspirational liberalism was just the delay that was never going to take place. They, you know, throwing these principles up there and saying, "Oh, we're almost there. We're almost there." Well, we're not going to get there, and that's why we have you know, the criteria of structural racism and the concrete goals of either reach this goal or eliminate this proposition or this institution. That's why we're there, I think, is that they got tired, many people got tired of saying this was coming down the line. So Martin Luther King's promissory note was never going to get cashed. Was the way I read much of the discontent on certain certain components, people on the left right now. I'll leave it there.
Can I add in on that? On that last point, Alan, I would agree that the left has given up on liberalism if 27 in 27 states in this country, the left had proposed to burn books or ban books. The left has not proposed to ban books in any legislature that I'm aware of. Now, there are tough issues like the amazing, wonderful Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, which every other word in that is the N-word. And yet it's an anti-slavery, I mean, it's written after slavery, but it's an anti-slavery treatise. And so there are tough challenges, but I don't think any of us in this room, and maybe you'll be the prove me wrong, who can cite an example where a left-wing legislator has proposed to ban books. And yet we have in 27 out of our 50 states proposals from the right to ban what they call CRT and so forth. And that's a problem, in my opinion. I would say, though, I'm much more optimistic than you are because you talked about vindicators versus prosecutor. And you'll laugh, but I don't consider myself a prosecutor. I consider myself a court reporter writing down what both sides said. Because you heard me praising the Declaration of Independence and criticizing its author, just as Erin did the same thing. She quoted the guy favorably, but also she got out of the rabbit hole of hypocrisy. It sounds to me like she's listening to both sides. We have one side in our country today that only wants to hear one side. We have the vast majority of Americans, I think, who are willing to listen to both sides. They don't want it rubbed in their face in a mean way, but they're willing to hear both sides. Can I say, finally, I like your point. A mongrel nation needs a founding moment. The only thing I would modify to that is add a word. A mongrel nation needs a mongrel founding movement. That's what we had in reality. That is, there were Native Americans and African Americans and women affecting the guys who made it to the back of the $2 bill. Even if they didn't make it to the back of the $2 bills, their influence did. And so, as someone said on Twitter to me, a beautiful statement, she's a professor at Marymount University, I'm just spacing her name, I'm sorry. She said, how can you expect women to unite around a founding that's all men? And you could say that, how can you expect people of color to unite around a founding that's all white people?
Well, thanks. I mean, I appreciate that. I don't. I hope that the fact that I criticize progressives doesn't mean I wouldn't be critical of the right. Trust me. I don't want to bore you with, we don't have enough time for that. And so, but I would say that there are illiberal tendencies on both sides these days that shake me, that make me worry, okay? And I don't know, I just don't see it as proper to simply say, well, one side is reasonable in their illiberal tendencies and the other side is not reasonable in their illiberal tendencies.
Is one side more illiberal than the other?
Oh, yes, oh, yeah.
Which
And
side
it's
is
the
that?
right.
Yeah.
The right is
We
much
agree.
more
So maybe we
illiberal.
agree on the larger.
I mean, the only problems I have
I know.
with the left these days is methodology. It's the technique of which they want their views to be propagated. I think progressivism is most convincingly promulgated through reason, and I think that I think progressivism wins through reason. If you want to make me come forward fully, but shortcutting it is what's creating some of these backlashes too. I mean, and
Yeah, I think it's fair.
I won't be saying anything else.
I also kind of perfect timing because I can build off of that, Alan, is that I think one of the challenges that we deal with, right, is that we as scholars of the revolution, let's say, scholars of the 18th century, our calls for acknowledging the complexity, we do that, right? We've read the stuff, we know it's complex. It's getting other people to actually consider that complexity is not a scary thing. Ambiguity is not a scary thing. Anybody who knows the musical Wicked, there's a great line that the wizard says where he talks about how people are afraid of ambiguity, right? And I think what to propose a solution, and perhaps this is ironic following up on Woody's comment about Twitter, there are very many good things that have come from Twitter. But, Twitter and email and, we have become a society that is very immediate and that speaks without thinking, and that is very quick to, make our point the most important. And maybe it's that I am a historian of the 18th century and I've absorbed it a little bit too much, but I think that stopping and thinking before we speak and asking if we need to have an opinion, if we need to voice our opinion at this time. I find myself, I made a rule a long time ago that as much as I want to correct strangers on Facebook about Thomas Jefferson, I am not allowed to respond to anything on Facebook about Thomas Jefferson, because it takes up too much of my time and too much of my energy. And the people who are on that platform don't want to listen to me. There are tons of books that can explain the complexities of Jefferson better than I can in, say, 200-word comments. The problem isn't that we haven't acknowledged the complexity, it's that we haven't come up with strategies for actually getting the public to listen to us when we talk about the complexity and to embrace that ambiguity.
Yeah, that's the question we haven't really ever gotten to, have we? So who's got like a last succinct but awesome question?
We have to leave because I wanted to ask you something.
Well, no, we don't have to. You know what? We actually
There's a happy hour.
we have a reception out there, so I'd like to let people get to the reception. But you can ask. Let's have Max, and then you can ask me something, and somebody will go get me a beer.
So I just wanted to say I really appreciate the full range of opinion that we have on the panel. But I wanted to ask a question that we discussed, the master's cohort discussed this summer. And it was, is it necessary at all, or not necessary at all, is it a possibility at all to have monuments that embody not particularly the ideals of founders, but instead virtues that may have been held by founders and that would be able to be aligned with the national identity as monuments in a nation, instead of creating a sort of heroic narrative around the founders?
Ooh, I have
Go
an
ahead.
answer. Thank you. Actually, so I think Mizzou's campus is kind of a great example of this, right? Jefferson himself recognized this. He is the author of what's on his tombstone. He writes what he wants to be remembered for. Author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia. Yeah.
Founder of the University of
Founder of the
Virginia.
University of Virginia. And he doesn't put these on a statue of himself. He puts it on an obelisk. It stands in for this meaning. And I think the problem that we see when we look at statues, like the one right next to it, and the one that has caused so much more controversy because students had far less problem with that obelisk that just says these things that Jefferson was proud of and that are actually important and aspirational, is that it glorifies the man. It encourages you to sit down and imagine that you would pal around with Thomas Jefferson and that your ideas, that Jefferson would listen to your ideas. Jefferson wouldn't listen to my ideas. He didn't think I was a real person.
Women should not furrow their brows with politics.
Yeah, he loves.
That wasn't me.
Well, that was Jefferson. But before he, well, and this is the point. Before he and Adams fall out, and for a lot of good reason, he likes Abigail Adams a lot. He really spends a lot of time with brilliant women, but he doesn't invite her to be part of these political conversations. He doesn't say, well, of course Abigail Adams should be somebody whose voice we hear, because she's saying just as smart of things in her letters to John that are not about her relationship with John. For me, the phrase that I like from the Remember the Ladies letter is not remember the ladies. It's right before it. It's when she says, remember that all men would be tyrants if they could. Remember that people are human and that you have to consider those things. And so in terms of physical monuments, I think we need to think more about the ideas that we want to celebrate as a nation rather than getting hung up on, would Thomas Jefferson be my friend? Because
You used the word virtues, which I'm uncomfortable with, but I like I've been saying principles, but you say aspirations, what I really like. But my big thing about statues, I want to design statues that are dyads. And I had to remind myself that I was using the word properly. I think I am. DYAD, anything that has two elements. And so leave the Jefferson Memorial, the Jefferson statue up in New York City Hall, but have that painting that I showed you in conversation with it. And I think I'd like to have, I don't want to take down the Jefferson Memorial in Washington. It's a beautiful building and there's some beautiful phrases written inside it. And it's a beautiful sculpture, you got to admit, of this man who owned 600 people. But put up a statue next to it, larger than it. And you're right, I'm sure Lemuel Haynes had his, I know Lemuel Haynes
the
had his vices as well.
The giant Martin Luther King is like around the corner.
Yeah, but I want Lemuel
think
Haynes to be towering over the Jefferson Memorial because he's the one who made it, what made the Declaration of Independence what it is today. Eric Slaughter persuades me. So dyadic monuments is my new push.
The really what you're asking, Max, is that can we handle representation anymore? We can't.
Of individuals.
Of individuals. I mean, it seems like we maybe. So what was your last thing you had?
Well, as a scholar of the 1790s, I want you to work the analogy to the present, and specifically in the line, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but Jake Silverstein, who was the editor of the New York Times Magazine, still is, who commissioned the 1619 Project, basically. He has a recent piece getting ready for their book saying, is it so bad that we always fight over the founding? Isn't that what a democracy does? And isn't that a healthy thing?
Oh, what you're asking me based on this, is it a healthy? I mean, it's a healthy thing until it isn't. I mean, the 1790s, the thing about the 1790s is it actually kind of turned out okay in the end because there wasn't, there wasn't violence, and that when someone lost the election, the other side actually left. No, they appointed a bunch of judges and stuff. I mean, I think there's a lot of things still. I think there's obviously the 1790s. There's all kinds of things that rhyme the president. But I don't know. I don't look back. I guess the thing about revolutionary republicanism that always sticks with me is the thing about all the previous republics is they don't exist anymore. So I'm not going to say. Obviously, one of them, at least as I should take no, yeah, let me take that. As I tried to say in my first book, and I've tried to say various times since then. I mean, one of the key debates that gets lost. We talk about states' rights and press freedom and all this stuff, and a lot of the big debate to me that was happening at the end of the 1790s was over whether the Republic could handle these kinds of arguments. And with Jefferson gives his inaugural where he in several other statements where he talks about the other side, the people who passed the Alien Sedition Acts is too fearful, that they didn't think we could survive, so I mean I think that's what one of the things that they were one of the things that was being decided there was whether they were going to try to have arguments and competitive elections and let everything be decided that way. Now, it worked out okay in some respects at first time. I mean, of course, obviously there's a lot of other things that maybe didn't flow that well from there. But I don't know that I think that I don't think that it's always going to, because I guess one of the things that does worry me is one of the things about the 1790s is that some of the principles of republicanism and beginnings of the principles of democracy were things that people were sort of naturally gravitated to and were kind of excited about. I guess I feel now like a weariness with that I find quite worrisome. So I don't know if this.
No,
That's what you're.
It was only the fourth presidential election, and it was very close, but they got through it, and the loser accepted the loss.
I guess
1800 was the fourth, right? Maybe we don't count late.
I guess if you count it as
by
89, right?
acclamation,
Yeah,
yeah.
fourth, right?
But it was only the fourth presidential election, and yet the loser, he wasn't happy, but he left.
He did.
And we're not so good at it's not the 45th. It's more than that. Whatever we're on now.
Well, of course,
well.
Alan praised us for our nonpartisanship. So I think.
Yep. Oh, sorry.
Just
Sorry.
leave it
I
there.
would be equally angry if the left didn't go away.
Thank Woody and Aaron and Alan for a great discussion and. Enjoy our full reception. Think about it.